In a world similar to Earth but set 800 years ago, there existed a planet smaller and closer to its sun. It was home to a group of 30 scientists who were sent to observe the evolution of society on this foreign land. However, these scientists were forbidden from interfering with the natural course of the civilization. Yet, despite their observations, a renaissance never took place. The setting was the city of Arcanar, the capital of Ultergolfo. The downfall began with the destruction of the university, where scholars and thinkers were hunted down. Some of these intellectuals fled to the neighboring city, Irukan, which was considered a safer place, while others were captured, tortured, or executed by the forces led by Don Riba, the crown security minister. The members of his squads, including shopkeepers and drovers, wore gray clothes, reflecting the bleakness of the city, where everyone dressed in the color of local stone, dull and drab. In the streets of Arcanar, two men could be seen smearing mud on each other's faces. A noble, clearly of high status, wandered the alleys in search of Fika the butcher. The planet's weather was harsh, short, sticky rains followed by long, foggy days. In the midst of this grim atmosphere, a nobleman named Don Rumata Leonid Yarmolnik lay in a fitful sleep. He often cried out in his dreams, haunted by his past acts of violence that he was forbidden to commit. His dreams were filled with the echoes of his grandmother's voice, reassuring him that children's tears are just water and that everything was only in his mind. Rumata awoke with his head on the table. Struggling to stand, he first asked his slave if he had fed his turtle. His breakfast lay half-eaten in front of him, and he absent-mindedly grabbed his flute from the table. As he cleaned it, his slave covered his ears as it was strictly forbidden for them to listen to music. Rumata began playing the flute, his melancholy music filling the halls of his grand castle. His slaves followed him as he strolled through the castle, their ears muffled from the music they were not allowed to hear. Rumata, irritated by one slave who had dared to speak while he was sleeping, threatened to sell him at the port. The slaves, without question, continued to follow his commands, all while keeping their ears covered. In the city, a large, unsatisfied man wandered through the streets, disappointed by the absence of mice despite the arrival of autumn. He picked up a handful of mud, throwing it in frustration. Elsewhere, soldiers were seen destroying a toilet, using a pole to dip it into the filth. They then placed the toilet seat on a man, mocking him before dragging him away. A fat man tried to remind the soldiers of something, but his words fell on deaf ears as they carried the poor soul off to an unknown fate. Rumata, riding with his cavalry, continued his journey toward Arcanar. He was tasked with saving the intellectuals of the land, those bookworms and scholars who were constantly persecuted by Don Riba's gray troops. These gray soldiers, who had taken control through usurpation and oppression, were responsible for wiping out free thought and culture in the city. On his way, Rumata met a fat man walking beside him, wearing kite-like wings. The man was learning to fly, but the wings were ineffective, and he mostly plummeted to the ground. Desperate, the man begged Rumata to take him away, but Rumata only tossed a coin at him in response. As Rumata continued his journey, he encountered Budak, a sober and logical doctor who had been brought to Arcanar from Irukan. Budak was a brilliant mind, and one of the few people Rumata could engage with in meaningful conversation. But one day, Budak mysteriously disappeared, along with his guards. Rumata later learned from Muga, his head slave, about a tobacco grower from Tobacco Street, a man who was known for his intellect. Rumata, always looking for ways to protect the brilliant minds of Arcanar, hid these scientists in the swamps that surrounded the city, hoping they could remain hidden from the cruel regime. The swamps were home to many other refugees, people like the drowned bookworms, the rebel peasants from the Haunchback, and former slaves from the tin mines. They had learned to survive by paying the price or dying. These were the ones who created the second nature, a reflection of a world filled with beauty that was inaccessible to most of the population. They crafted glass that helped the blind see and sought to bring the beauty of art and knowledge to a world that had forgotten them. One night, while sneaking into Arcanar, Rumata met another Earthling, and the two engaged in conversation. The Earthling revealed that a boy had volunteered to snitch on others, leading to the arrest of a group of intellectuals. Rumata, disgusted by the betrayal, walked away from the scene, knowing that the situation in Arcanar was getting worse. Later, Rumata and his men encountered a group of soldiers and nobles, and one man shared that he had adopted a boy due to loneliness. He had a son now, and the man's joy contrasted sharply with the chaos around them. A madman appeared, telling Rumata that Budak had been kidnapped and would be killed. Rumata was informed that the boy who had betrayed them had been caught, But it was too late. Budak's fate had already been sealed. In the midst of all this turmoil, another man arrived, injured from a boar trap. He told Rumata that 20 years ago an earthling had called for a renaissance, the triumph of art and culture. But on this planet, that vision had never come to pass. Another man spoke of walking alone to a place where he had been attacked by a runaway slave. He showed the marks of the attack, and his words painted a grim picture of a world where survival was all that mattered. In the land of Arkanar, there is a mysterious figure named Rumata, who is known for his strange behavior and his connection with the powerful elite. One day, a man claims that another person who calls himself Munchausen is lying. The man suggests that this Munchausen must be lying because he has a crew of guards at his disposal. Rumata is involved in an odd scene where he finds a boar trap that had been removed from a man named Peska's leg. As the events unfold, one of the men begins singing while Rumata teases him with a shovel, creating a bizarre scene in the midst of the tense atmosphere. Rumata returns to his slaves, who are in the middle of a strange and disturbing task. They keep repeating that birds exist, but only a person named Muga has actually seen them. These slaves, along with a young boy, are pouring a mysterious substance over the body of an elderly man who is suspended by a rope. Just as the scene becomes more unsettling, another man walks by, completely naked, holding his clothes in his hands. Rumata's slave tries to stop him, but Rumata insists that he move forward, threatening to flog him if he does not. At this point, Rumata pulls out a bird from his palm, and the slave continues moving, muttering that he would rather be buried in the ground than thrown into the gulf. Rumata is concerned about the fate of Budak, a man who seems to have disappeared, and arranges to meet with the king and Don Reba to find out more. He enters the castle, where he finds men reciting poetry and others dressed in heavy armor. In a strange and uncomfortable interaction, Rumata kisses the prince's knee and then asks a bald woman if the prince has cried that day, while she grabs him in return. Amid this, a man informs Rumata that Budak had never been to his office, while drinking milk from a bowl like a dog. He also learns that Colonel Khusus, the leader of the Crown Guards, has left the army and is now in the lilac chambers with Don Reba, speaking in an unfamiliar language. Rumata suggests showing Don Reba the holy relics of his father, possibly to make him disappear as well. This sparks his curiosity, as Colonel Khusus is a notorious figure, covered in blood from his deeds. Rumata, intrigued, plays his flute while contemplating the situation, but he fails to learn anything about Budak's whereabouts. The story takes a turn as Rumata finds his friend Pampa, a local baron who has fallen from grace, and the two share a drunken night together. However, their revelry is cut short when Rumata is arrested by the Greys, the enforcers of Don Reba's rule, and taken to him for interrogation. Don Reba, now the leader of a militant religious sect, believes Rumata might be a god and seeks to test his divine powers. Rumata, always quick-witted, convinces Reba that he is indeed a god, and in exchange for his release, he is given security clearance bracelets. As night falls, the black-robed monks of the order invade the city, seizing control of Arkanar. The king and his family are executed, and the courtiers are publicly killed as well. Rumata, disillusioned by the chaos, decides to take action. He goes to the Tower of Joy to rescue Budak, who is imprisoned, and Baron Pampa, who also finds himself in the same predicament. However, tragedy strikes as Pampa is killed by arrows during their escape. With his friend lost, Rumata seeks answers from Budak, hoping to find a solution to the turmoil in Arkanar. Budak, in his wisdom, tells Rumata that the weak will always replace the strong, and this cycle of power struggles will never end. Rumata, exhausted and defeated, returns to his home, only to find that his castle has been attacked during the night. Two of his servants, including his favorite, Uno, a mischievous young man, are killed. This marks a turning point for Rumata, who is left wondering what more he can do to change the course of events. In his frustration, Rumata meets Arata, a revolutionary figure who urges him to lead a slave uprising using his knowledge of Earth technology. However, Rumata refuses, believing that time will simply pass, and that exploitation and slavery will continue in a never-ending cycle. He gives Arata a protective bracelet from the Order, ordering his servants to drive him away. The following day, tragedy strikes once again as Ari, Rumata's lover, is killed by an arrow through the back of her head. Furious and heartbroken, Rumata vows revenge. He confronts the leader of the Order, a former university student named Arima, and declares that he will kill them all. Rumata kills Arima first, and after disemboweling his body and exposing his still-beating heart, he sets out for the city. He massacres everyone in his path, seeking justice for Ari's death and his own shattered ideals. In the aftermath of the violence, a group of Earthmen, led by Don Condor, walks through the ruins of Arkanar. They discover mountains of corpses, including those of Arata and Don Reba. Through their conversation, it is revealed that Arata had killed Ari in an attempt to manipulate Rumata, knowing that his anger would lead him to strike out at the order. However, Arata was also killed in the process. Eventually, Don Condor and Pashka find Rumata, who is sitting alone in a puddle wearing his pajamas. He has rejected their offer to return him to Earth, and with a weary voice, he states, "A god can get tired too." Don Condor silently acknowledges his decision, understanding that Rumata has become a part of the world he once tried to escape. As the story concludes, Rumata reflects on the endless cycles of power and violence that plague the world. He offers a grave warning to Don Condor, where gray's triumph, blacks always come in the end. In his final moments, Rumata advises Don Condor on how to report his actions, telling him, "Tell him that it is hard to be a god." With this, Don Condor and Pashka leave, and Rumata, now older and graying, sets off into the snowy distance, surrounded by his slaves and horsemen. As he walks, a little girl and her father pass by, and the girl asks her father what he thinks of Rumata's saxophone playing. The father, unsure, responds that it makes his stomach hurt. The girl, with innocent honesty, agrees, and they continue on their way. In the end, Rumata remains in Arkanar, no longer an outsider, but a part of the world he once tried to change. And to change to a new and nice story, I recommend you click my recaps on the right. Continue your binge in peace, my friend. Subscribe and drop a like to return for future uploads. Grab your popcorn, enjoy yourself, and see you soon, my friend.